Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. If anyone can't, please shout out and let me know. My name is Maggie Redfern, and I am the Associate Director of the Connecticut College Arboretum. I want to thank you all for joining us for this virtual SALT conference. We were really sorry to miss the conference last year and are excited to be able to offer this series of lunchtime lectures for folks to be able to participate in what we feel is a really important conference and very important mission. For those of you who aren't familiar with SALT, it's always a curious question, what does SALT mean? I want to share a little bit about the history of SALT, and then I will introduce our speaker today and turn it over to Juliana. SALT, or the Smaller American Lawns Today movement, was the brainchild of the late Connecticut College professor William Nearing. He was a botany professor and mentor to hundreds of students from 1952 until his passing in 1999. For more than 20 years, he was also director of our Connecticut College Arboretum. In the early 1970s, to decrease fossil fuel usage, noise pollution, and air pollution from gas-powered mowers, he began to decrease the size of lawn on his 1-acre property. And in 1977, he wrote an article called "Put Your Mower in Mothballs," advocating for naturalistic landscaping by using native trees and shrubs or old field grasses and wildflowers. His experiences and understanding of ecosystems led him to introduce the Smaller American Lawns Today initiative at the Arboretum's Friends Night in June of 1997. His goal was to encourage homeowners to become the salt of the earth and design their grounds for using environmentally sound practices that are in harmony with nature. What you can cut with a push mower is about the right size of a lawn, he advocated. To honor his memory and to further his ideas, we commenced the annual SALT conference in 2002. Professor Nearing's research spanned a variety of ecosystems and habitats. He was an internationally recognized expert on the ecology of wetlands and tidal marshes. His work contributed to the scientific community's knowledge of the importance that wetlands serve in the environment. He was instrumental in helping to pass the Connecticut Tidal Wetlands Act in 1969, which prevented the loss of wetlands due to dredging and filling activities. He also worked on ecological restoration efforts on wetlands throughout Connecticut. During this year in which we've received massive amounts of stormwater from 2 tropical storms, it seemed appropriate to focus this year's SALT talks on the theme of watershed. And I just want to kind of play a little bit on this term of watershed. We think of watershed in a couple of different ways. There's the physical definition of watershed, being a land area that channels rainfall and snow melt to creeks and streams and rivers, and eventually outflows to points such as Long Island Sound and the oceans around the world. There's also the figurative definition of watershed, being the dividing point or turning point, a time when important change happens. And that's something that I would like to think this conference will start, that we will have a turning point on how we view the watershed and how we view our landscape in the watershed. So that's just a little bit about the history of the SALT conference. I want to mention that, after today, there are many other ways to get information on native plants and ecological landscaping. In addition to all of the resources available here at Connecticut College Arboretum, a co-sponsor for this program, the Connecticut Mountain Laurel chapter of Wild Ones, is a great resource. They were established in 2006 in partnership with the Arboretum The Connecticut chapter of Wild Ones is a local chapter of a national organization which promotes the practice of gardening in our communities and around the country for using native plants. The local chapter meets once a month for field trips and lectures, and these are free and open to the public. We also are hosting our Ecological Landscape Symposium in January of 2022, another virtual program. This one will be spread over 4 interactive half days with a dozen speakers discussing a range of ecology-based approaches to landscape design. I just want to make sure, I know it looks like 1 or 2 of you might have your videos on. If you could please make sure that your audio is on mute during the presentation, and also I'll ask that you turn off your video during the presentations just so there aren't further distractions. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Juliana Barrett is an an extension educator with the Connecticut Sea Grant program at Avery Point campus and the Connecticut NEMO program. As an ecologist, her focus is the coastal habitats of Connecticut. She works with towns and other groups working on conservation, restoration, and enhancement of coastal areas. Juliana is developing programs to assist coastal community leaders with technical matters related to the impact of land use on coastal habitats, riparian buffers, habitat management, and restoration of coastal habitats. She's also developing a coastal forest management plan for a preserve in Stonington that she's just starting the research on, but I think someday it might be great to invite her back to give us more details about the work that she's doing there. One thing that's really interesting about all of this work that Juliana is doing is her emphasis on creating living landscapes and also providing public access to those landscapes. Juliana is the co-author of The Vegetation of Connecticut, Connecticut DEP publication. She's also co-author of Salt Marsh Plants of Long Island Sound, which is an arboretum bulletin that we have available if anyone would like that. She's also working with us on a guide to plants on the beaches and dunes of Connecticut. So if anyone wants to contribute or add to that, please be in touch with us. Juliana has a PhD from the University of Connecticut, Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and an MA from the Department of Earth and Planetary Science at Johns Hopkins University, and a bachelor's degree from Smith College in Biology. It is my great pleasure to introduce Juliana today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I am so delighted to be here, and just to follow up on your introduction about the SALT conference and Dr. Nearing, I just want to say I don't think anyone could meet Bill Nearing and not be inspired. And so I think this is a wonderful opportunity to talk about riparian buffers. And at the end of the conference, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to ask you what you think Bill Nearing would think of riparian buffers. So please keep that in mind as we go along. So I'm going to be talking to you today about riparian buffers, And so just to put us all on the same page, I just want to provide a definition. So riparian refers to that area along the banks of a river, stream, or other body of water. And a corridor is just simply a designated zone of a specified width along the border of an area. So when we put them together, we have that natural vegetation and the soil cover adjacent to a river, stream, or other body of water. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about riparian corridors and buffers. We're not talking about any regulated areas. So here's what a nice riparian buffer could look like. And when we don't have any of that vegetation, here's what it can look like. So a pretty stark contrast. So the idea of riparian buffers really are not new. In the 6th century, Italy's coast had become so popular that Emperor Justinian passed an ordinance preventing building within 100 feet of the water, and that was in order to protect the views. 14 centuries later, Cape Cod building authorities passed an identical ordinance of no building with 100 feet of the water, but with the purpose of protecting the environment. So we're not talking about a new idea, but what we really want to explore here is, why should we care about this riparian area, and how might we manage it and restore it? So one of the first places to start is with the function. So what is it that riparian corridors do? Well, there's a number of really significant functions that they have in terms of water quality, biodiversity, protection, and safety. There's actually economic opportunities, protecting soils, visual quality, and outdoor recreation, really depending on the size of the buffer. So riparian areas are really the first line of defense against the impacts of impervious surfaces. Maggie talked about watersheds, and we have so much impervious surfaces within our watersheds for the most part. That water flows off, and if we have riparian buffers, they can play a role before that runoff gets into our waterways. And these plants, the riparian areas, can also help to slow the runoff. They can protect shorelines from erosion, aid in flood control. They filter and trap pollutants, and they're actually very significant for wildlife, including fish. So just to explore those a little bit, in terms of water quality, it's really in the first and second order streams at the heads of our streams where they all begin, that are really the really significant areas for these riparian corridors and filtering the water quality. You see in the other photo there, stream bank stabilization, where you have lawn all the way to the edge of the bank with very little vegetation and a lot of erosion there. Well, having a riparian corridor or riparian buffer is not going to stop flooding, but it can certainly help to mitigate some of the impacts, slowing the floodwaters, helping to absorb floodwaters, much like our marshes act like sponges. When we have a coastal storm, riparian corridors can function in much the same way. There's a lot of documented really important biodiversity functions in terms of buffers, in terms of increases of aquatic and terrestrial habitat, protecting very sensitive areas, creating corridors and connecting our different waterways, increasing access to food resources for animals, and very importantly, providing shade to maintain water temperature. This is just a photo collage of some of our native Connecticut animals that benefit from riparian corridors. There's quite a few. This is just some of the more photogenic ones. And riparian buffers are really important for aquatic species. They provide woody debris for aquatic habitat structure. They maintain the in-stream, that microclimate, food for some of the larvae, and again, helping to protect water quality. So this is a picture of a brook trout, and groups like Trout Unlimited have been very, very active in planting riparian buffers in order to shade the water, right? Which is imperative for the successful growth of brook trout. So that's just one group that's been very active in planting riparian buffers. Woody debris is also really, really important for the larval stages of many insects. And I love the photo that you see there on the bottom left. This is volunteers actually putting woody debris back into the area for amphibians and turtles, as well as insects. We tend to like things very clean and tidy. So here we're trying to mess things up a little bit. And it's actually been documented that riparian buffers can actually have significant economic and safety values in terms of minimizing property damage during certain flood events, decreasing public investment in stormwater management, flood control, and pollution removal, increasing property values, and reducing land maintenance costs. Again, thinking about mowing for example, mowing lawns down to the edge of a river, a pond, a stream, or whatever that water body might be. This is some work that was done by the Center for Watershed Protection. And what you can see is that the closer you are to a vegetated riparian buffer, there's an increase in the property values. So this has been actually very well documented. So look, that's sort of a background on why these areas are important, why we should care about them. And then, of course, the next question is, well, how big do they have to be in order to provide any of those functions and values that we just talked about? And it really depends, right, on very much on the site conditions. So first and foremost, where are we within the watershed? If you think about the Connecticut River watershed, for example, and all the tributaries that feed into it, it's one thing to start way up in Canada, thinking about riparian buffers up there, versus when we're down in Old Lyme or right at the mouth of the Connecticut River and thinking about riparian buffers there. So location within the watershed can be very important. What are the soil types along the water body? What is that slope like? Is it a really steep slope? Is it gradual? What's the local hydrology? And what function? What is it we want this buffer to do? Because as you can see, this is one that refers to lakes. Erosion control right along the bank is much smaller than if we want to treat different types of runoff. Agricultural treatment. So when you have an agricultural field and then a riparian buffer and then a water body, the bigger that buffer is, and we're talking hundreds of feet in some circumstances, in order to control some of the runoff from those agricultural fields is really what's necessary. And for wildlife, many of them need hundreds of feet in order to successfully live within these areas. But the bottom line is bigger is better, but something is better than nothing, right? So a small riparian corridor, 10, 25 feet, can certainly have ecological value. It's going to provide some protection for water quality, some of that stream bank stabilization, small scale travel routes, areas for nesting, basking sites, and so on. The bigger it is, the more benefits accrue from that increased width. And then what's in that riparian corridor can also have an impact on how it functions. So this is from the Connecticut River Watersheds Bulletin. And you can see that grasses, shrubs, and trees have different benefits in terms of what they provide for these different values. What I want to do is really quickly, again, tying back to Dr. Nearing, is show you a project that was done by Emily Wilson of CLEAR, which is the Center for Land Use Education and Research. All this information is publicly accessible. You can go into this website and poke around, but CLEAR has the land cover for the state of Connecticut from 1985, and now I think we're up to 2020, but this study goes through 2015. So we have the land cover, so we understand what is on our landscape. And what Emily did is for the Long Island Sound area, she looked at the riparian areas, and so all the waterways, and then she created a line that's a 300-foot buffer. So in that second picture there, you can see this dark blue line. So this is a 300-foot buffer from the edge of the wetland, okay? And then she was able to look at the land cover within that 300-foot buffer. And here you can see in this last image, the riparian area, the 300-foot, and what the land cover is within that. So here is where Conn College is in here. And this is the riparian land cover area for the waterways in 1985. So this is the different waterways, right? This is our 300-foot buffer. And it looks twice as big here because we're going 300 feet to either side the stream bank or whatever it is. And the different land uses that you can see, the greens are forest, whether deciduous or evergreen. Red is developed land. The yellow is turf and grass, and so on. So this is 1985, and this is 2015. And what's wonderful about having this information in a GIS system is that we can look at the difference between 1985 and 2015 pretty much with the click of a button. So here is the change in riparian land cover between those two time periods. And what I really want you to be able to focus on is the red and the yellow. The red, if you remember, is the developed land. So these are areas in red that have changed to developed, and the areas in yellow are areas that have changed to turf and grass. The other really powerful thing that we can do with this is we can actually look, I'm just going to move this a second. So we're going to, oops, I'm sorry. Getting ahead of myself here. There we go. So what we can do is we can look at the percent change and actually look at the number of square miles of turf and grass that we've lost, developed land that we've gained, agricultural land that has been lost, and forest land, which is a big one. We've lost a lot of forest cover over this time period. So just a really powerful tool that allows us and would allow a town, for example, say a wetlands commission, to say, oh, we can really go in and take a look at what's happening to our riparian buffers in town and see how much they're changing. Are we really losing the benefits that these areas provide? Okay, and then one other thing that you can do is look at these small watersheds and get a quick synopsis. So we can see, again, just that summary for this small watershed here from 1985 to 2015. We've lost almost 1,000 acres of forest, lost 153 acres of ag land, gained turf and grass, and also gained almost 700 acres of developed land just within this one small watershed in the town of Preston. So again, a tool that is accessible to anyone to go in and take a look and play with. So I think I'd be really remiss to not mention climate change and how significant it is, the role that riparian buffers play when we're talking about climate change. So as I'm sure you're all aware, we have air temperatures increasing, and as the air temperature rises, our surface waters are increasing, in some cases pretty substantially. There's significant changes in the magnitude of precipitation, and that leads to more stormwater runoff. Here in the Northeast, we're seeing a really substantial increase in these really intense rain events, oftentimes followed by periods of no rain or even drought. And along with changes in our air temperatures, we're seeing shifts in the reproductive phenology of plants and animals, as well as in their distributions. So USDA plant hardiness zones have shifted. Spring comes approximately 2 weeks earlier than it did in years past. And so there's a lot of concern about migration routes, food being available for animals as they migrate north, for example, especially if that phenology, that timing of when things leaf out or when they flower is shifting. And if those two things are out of sync, it can lead to some pretty serious consequences for those animals. So why are these riparian areas significant when we think about climate change? Well, riparian buffers are naturally resilient to extremes. These are areas that, for the most part, are pretty quiet, calm, peaceful. But when there's one of these significant rain events, they flood, right? and it may take a few hours, a few days, depending on the rain event, for things to go back to normal. These riverine habitats function as corridors for many plants and animals, and climate change is causing those distributional shifts that we just talked about. Thermal refugia, so these areas, because water has a very high heat capacity, and they really protect riparian organisms against extreme temperatures. That's why it's so important to maintain shade along these areas for many of these organisms. And then there's the hydrological benefits. So increased frequency of extreme rain events, flood events, altered changes in precipitation and runoff. As I said, these riparian, the riparian vegetation really increases the infiltration and can help mitigate some of those flood impacts. So where do we begin when we want to start to really think about, well, you know, how do we start? What do we do with a riparian buffer? And so I want to show you one example of some work that several of us did. We developed a coastal riparian plant list, and just recently updated that with wildlife and pollinator values. So these are native plants, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that. And I worked with a landscape architect student to create some cross sections and plane views so that people can see, and this applies on the coast or inland. The big, you know, if people live near the water, they want to have those water views, the water access, but you can have all those things without having zero riparian buffer. So I'm going to show you some examples. So what we did to create our plant list, we looked at a couple of different soil types, and we looked at different zones of salt tolerance, thinking about salt spray from storms, but really think about salt from in the winter, right? When there's ice and snow and salt gets applied to those roads. I see salt marsh plants further and further inland because of all the salt that's going into our road systems and getting into the nearby areas. We looked at some exposure in terms of how much sunlight different plants needed. We looked at evergreen and deciduous. And the really hard thing with natives is their availability from local nurseries. And we had a long discussion about what to include because we have wonderful plants like northern bayberry, and there are plenty of non-natives like the shore juniper that's we see in many, many areas. It's non-native. And because of the funding from the grant that we had, we did stick to just native plants. And another thing about our native grasses is they have wonderful deep root systems. You can see this one extends, you know, anywhere from 5 to 8 feet. And that's really what we need when we talk about that shoreline stabilization and protection. So grasses and their root systems, it's not just what's above ground, it's what's going on below the ground that can be really significant in helping to get all those functions from our riparian buffers. We looked at different slopes of land, right? Sometimes it's very steep and sometimes just a very gradual slope. We looked at areas thinking about with or without salt spray and without seawalls. So here's the website that you can go to if you want to take a look at that. And here's one of those cross sections. So again, coming up with different ideas depending on, so here's a seawall, what can we plant in this area? And so the zones 2 and 3 correspond to lists of different plants that would be applicable to these areas and still have some lawn that could be mown with that hand mower. Here's another example where there's no seawall. This area might get flooded during a high tide event or a storm. Moderately steep slope, again, coming up with a different set of plants and potential for things that could be planted here. And here's one of those bird's eye views, the plane view. So you can see that you can still have your water access, beautiful water views, and still maintain a riparian buffer in these areas. And even though we focused on the coast and salt tolerance here. The same applies for inland areas. So here you can see, I'm just going to show you some examples of what we want to try to avoid. So here's using riprap, all these different rocks to stabilize the shoreline. Here's a wall being used to stabilize the shoreline. Here's a wall with some plantings, but still there's very little benefit in terms of filtering runoff or anything else. And here's a very steep slope where they are planting vegetation. So I happened to kayak by this area just as it was being planted. So you can see, I guess they took down a lot of trees, not sure why, but maybe for the view, but at least they're planting vegetation back into it. And here's an area where you can see just natural vegetation on the, over here on the side, you can see that there's the water access. They're up high enough that they still have a view, but you're getting all the benefits from this vegetated area. So I thought it'd be fun to take a look at some of the plants that would work both along the coast and further inland. Northern bayberry is one of the really nice ones that does extremely well. And remember, these are areas that flood at times and dry out at other times. So you're really getting, you want things that can sometimes have their roots wet, sometimes wetter if they're down towards the edge of the stream or the lake or the pond or whatever it might be. Maybe some things are a little bit further up. So we have a really wide palette of plants that we can be thinking about for these areas. We just have to be really thoughtful in terms of their placement. A couple of our native roses, as much as I love Rosa rugosa, it is non-native. It has been documented as being, have a tendency toward being invasive along the coast. I would never advocate for ripping it out, but if you wanted to plant some roses, I would go with the native ones. Eastern red cedar, beach plums. We were just talking about beach plums before the conference itself started. The service berries, the amelanchiers, a couple of different species are just fabulous. They form these wonderful copses and really do extremely well in these riparian corridor areas. Chokeberry, ground covers, bearberry, the beach pea. I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but along the rest areas of Connecticut, they have been planting more and more bearberry, which is, I think it makes for a beautiful ground cover. Where seaside goldenrod is just fabulous for the butterflies in the fall. And American beach grass, switchgrass. Here's big blue stem and little blue stem, two really beautiful grasses again. Very, very deep root systems. Indian grass, and then some of our herbaceous perennials like the Joe pieweeds, swamp rose mallow. I've actually seen it in some areas that are not all that wet, even though we tend to think of it as growing in the brackish tidal wetlands. And so one of the complaints about riparian areas is that they get messy. And so I was doing some reading and came across some really nice ideas for how to both make them look better and ideas to show that these are areas that are being maintained while still having that ecological function. So it's really all about first thinking about what you could plant, what's your physical location, right? What are your soils, your slope, exposure, and all those different things. What do you want it to do? Because a lot of times Trout Unlimited will go in, they want something that's going to grow really fast and provide shade, along the edges of the stream corridor. They'll use a lot of willows. But we have the opportunity in these areas for great diversity of different plants. Using selective mowing to indicate that this area is being taken care of without reducing the ecological function. So some limited mowing can really help, and using really bold planting patterns to indicate that thought was put into this. And there's a reason for all of it. Thinking about different textures and forms of plants can also really help. One of the things that I was reading about suggested something like very simple fencing, like the split rail fence that you see here, again, to show that this is an area that is being maintained. Putting in nesting boxes, signage, great opportunities for educational signage in these areas. And here's what they can look like. So this is just a 3-foot buffer. Obviously has been planted with some wildflowers and other things. It's going to provide at least some filtration of stormwater runoff. One other thing that's really great to think about is the potential for pollinators. As you think about different plants that you might put in a riparian buffer. And as we move inland, so this doesn't have to be just coastal, but here are some of the trees, our native trees that would do well in a riparian buffer. Again, I think we're getting more and more possibilities as we think about climate change, about a longer growing season. Sweet gum is known natively in Connecticut, in southwestern Connecticut, but I'm sure it's going to be spreading pretty rapidly as temperatures warm up even more. Some of our smaller trees that would do well in these areas, mentioned the serviceberries, dogwoods would do extremely well. Buttonbush, swamp azalea, things that we think of, and some things that we really only see when we get into the swampier areas. But some research has been done on buttonbush that it does extremely well in upland areas as well. So, you know, it's an opportunity to do a little bit of experimentation as well. Ferns, lots, so many different ferns, and the equisetum, the horsetails. So lots of opportunity to play with things like the ferns. And grasses and sedges, certainly. Again, wide ranges of opportunity, from things that grow in the very wet to the not so wet. Jack-in-the-pulpit, swamp milkweed. Since our growing season just ended, it's kind of fun to look at some of the flowering plants and think about potential for next year. The boneset, chelone, the turtlehead, pickerel weed, irises, cardinal flower. Again, some of these really, really striking flowers. You know that when you walk along a river floodplain that's forested, you might see these right along the edges. And our asters, so these are all natives that would do well in these different types of riparian areas. And here's someone's yard. Again, so it could be a very small pond. We don't have to be thinking a river or a huge stream, a huge lake, but lots and lots of opportunities to just put in some small buffers. You know, I'm sure this small buffer provides protection from road runoff and lawn runoff as well. These are lake shores. Again, just different examples. It's an opportunity to go nuts with wildflowers, and you can see this one on the bottom here is mown right up to the edge. And one of the things, I worked with Pat Young and Jane Browerman several years ago with one of the conservation districts, and we modeled this after a program that was down in Virginia called Buffer in a Bag. And so we picked out several different species of trees and shrubs and some perennials that were perfect to plant along a riparian buffer. 20 small plants sold for $40, and they sold out every year. So again, look to your conservation districts and their plant sales for opportunities such as this. So what do you think Bill Nearing would think about riparian buffers, given that he was a strong advocate for smaller American lawns today? Well, I think he'd really like the idea. So the take-home message, riparian buffers or corridors can really play a significant role in helping to protect the functions and values of our rivers and wetlands. They can mitigate the impacts of climate change, at least help, and they can reduce the amount of lawn while providing beauty, wildlife value, and habitat in and of themselves. So thank you. I'll stop there and happy to have a conversation and have people chime in.
Juliana, thank you so much. I completely agree that Bill Nearing would be in favor of riparian buffers. And as we think about what you presented today, you covered so many different things. But this idea of creating living landscapes really is so important throughout Connecticut, not just along the coast and not just along waterways, but in all of our backyards. I was amazed to see, and I think Bill Nearing would be as well, how much of our landscape continues to be lost to deforestation. And I was also a little surprised to see the amount of increase in lawn over the past 20, 30 years. And this conference, our goal is to start reducing that and maybe asking these bigger questions of how do we and how do we get our neighbors to start thinking about making these changes in their landscapes. So I'd like to invite folks to turn on their videos and ask questions if they would like. You're also welcome to put questions in the chat. I know we had a question during your presentation, Juliana, about you quickly flashed through, and I didn't catch it either, a coastal riparian website, a resource for folks. And I know the Yukon site has a lot of resources, coastal resources. I can share one of those, but I didn't catch the riparian chat that you mentioned, or the riparian.
Yes, so I'm going to look it up and I'll put it in the chat.
That would be great. Thank you. I'll put just the link to the general page on coastal resources, which includes things like plant lists and different habitat types and planting along different habitats. I'll let you look for a moment, and then it looks like we have a question or two here in the chat.
Sure, go ahead. And I just found it. There we go.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. How do you explain to homeowners that road salt and sea salt are not the only sources of salt in landscapes and waterways, fertilizers, excessive manure, etc.?
That's a really good question, which, and you know, I'll give you some of my own thoughts. Yeah, you're absolutely right. When people hear salt, I think the first thing they think about is road salt. Very rarely sea salt, although now we're hearing a little bit more about it, or we hear about it like after a major storm, like after Irene and Sandy, when there was so much landscaping that was killed by that salt spray that went quite a few miles inland, even several miles inland. And I think when we talk about fertilizers, people just tend to think about nitrogen and phosphorus as being in those, but the salts, you know, that are in those are really significant. And I don't know if saying, you know, there's so many salts in there that they're going to impact your plantings, for example, versus saying it's too much nitrogen and fertilizer, or there's too many nutrients in there, too many chemicals in there that often get put on too heavily. People never want to hear that they can't use any. So it's just a matter of using it circumspectly, I think. But I'm sure other people have some thoughts, so please chime in.
The question was from Kathy Connolly. Kathy, I wonder if you had additional thoughts on that. You're welcome to chime in.
Hi. It's just that First of all, salt is very poorly understood, I think, by most consumers of landscape products. Even landscapers don't seem to understand it very well. And I have a very hard time getting some of the concepts across. And yet I think it's important, mainly and partly because when I go to explain selections on a plant list, I'm often, because the kind of people that I'm working with are sensitive to environmental issues by and large, and they want to know why we're doing this and not that. I would like to be able to say, well, this is more salt tolerant, and they say, but I'm not on the waterfront. And then but they still need to be aware of it. And I always advise people to get a salt report in their soil tests. But then it's always hard to explain, well, why do I need a salt report? And I wouldn't get any salt here, but you don't know that. And especially for a new homeowner. So that's the source of my questions, multiple sources. It comes up a fair amount. It comes up more than I would have guessed, but I appreciate your comments, Juliana. It's
and the road salt issue is a really fascinating one, just in the context that, you know, we all want to be safe. We all want to get out on the road as soon as the storm is over, right? And obviously DOT's mission is that safety issue. But I know folks at University of Connecticut have collaborated with DOT on salt conferences specifically. And there's still a huge amount of research going on with alternatives.
well, and that's it. Even the alternatives, is my understanding, it contains salt, even when they're not the CaCO3 or whatever that formula is. Even when it's like one of the magnesium-based products. Magnesium, my understanding is, in that formulation is a salt. It just maybe is interacting differently with the environment than traditional rock salt would.
Right.
And so I think this is something that's not often talked about, and it has huge impact on water from what I can tell. And so do you have any thoughts on how riparian buffers interact with salt inputs that come from the land rather than from the water?
So there's been a huge amount of research on the role of riparian buffers removing different compounds. Much of that research comes from agricultural studies, right?
Great.
Looking mainly at different fertilizers, but there have been some on salts. And unfortunately, it usually takes a really wide riparian buffer to have a significant impact on removing different compounds, whether it's agricultural runoff or road runoff. Right.
And it's also, if I understand correctly, it's also the case that fertilizers, when they build up over so many years, they do a salt. And my understanding is a salt is simply something, a mineral that's electronically neutral. It has a neutral charge or a no charge. Is maybe I don't know the right way to say it, but anyway. And the impact of that on plants is to impair their ability to take up water. Because it changes the pressure equation between the soil and the root. So it's important in that regard, but then when you let it get down into water bodies, that's particularly scary in terms of protecting anything that lives in water.
Very much so.
Yeah.
I think you've been doing your research. You sound very knowledgeable.
We're trying, but it doesn't, it's hard for me. I struggle with it, and then to explain it to somebody else is. So, are you aware of a simple guide to salts?
That's a great question, and I do not know. I don't know if anybody else does, but I will ask some of my colleagues who really focus on stormwater if there is, and if so, I will pass them on to Maggie.
Thank you so much. Then the second question has to do with autumn leaves in water. It is my crude understanding that that when you're in a natural area and it's surrounded by trees, they shed their leaves into the water. And as long as it's basically in balance with the pond or stream or whatever that the leaves are falling into, that's actually a bonus for aquatic life. That it creates good stuff for the food chain. But when you're blowing your leaves into a pond or raking them into a pond to like hide them and overloading or sending them down a storm drain, that it actually can turn into a massive source of phosphorus pollution and other things. Do you want to comment on that?
I think you know more than I do. Certainly, you know, that just the natural leaf litter decomposes over time and is really important. When you have a huge amount going in there, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't.
So in Wisconsin, the Clean Lakes Alliance in Madison and a couple other Wisconsin cities have a lot of information on this. And I was just wondering if any of your work had touched on leaves, because I see people blowing leaves into ponds.
Right.
And it's another thing that is, I'm guessing, not great.
No, you know, I mean, there's that balance between what can decompose, right, over a year, say,
right,
versus what starts to just pile up and impact the water itself.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We have another question in the chat, and Kathy, thanks for all your comments and questions and information that you provided. But the question, more of a comment maybe from Russ. I've always wondered why beach plums are not deployed more frequently in parking lot islands, which can get hot, dry, and salt exposure from snow management. Exactly the conditions that beach plums like. So I think that's something worth, I'll let you comment on that, but also worth mentioning that so many of these plants that you shared with us today aren't restricted to coastal locations and are not restricted to being in, you know, riparian buffer zones, that so many of these plants will do very well in home landscapes or even the harsh conditions of a parking lot.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think beach plums would be fabulous in parking lots. You know, I don't know what goes into the thought process when they pick out plants. I only wonder if their concern would be the number of birds that would come in, you know, and maybe other wildlife that might come in when they're in fruit. And I don't know to what degree, if at all, they try to avoid certain things because of that. But as a species, I think it would be great.
Well, and maybe we need to start thinking about, instead of just riparian buffers, parking lot buffers, because our parking lots have so much impervious surface and no shade, nowhere for the water to go, usually except for pipes. But if we could create riparian buffers or create parking lot buffers using these native plants, creating habitat for the animals, the insects, the birds, that there can be space for that as well. I mean, I think some of those examples or slides you showed of change over time in Connecticut just shows that we're actually losing more and more of this important habitat, and we're losing more and more of our living landscape, and that's what we really need to work on restoring.
You know, I think this whole idea of parking lots is really a fabulous idea. And I can't stand it when you see a new development or a new business or something, and the parking lot has no trees in it whatsoever. I mean, just thinking about climate change and the need to have shade. So I'm totally with you.
We'll have to work on our town's planning and development committees and get them to take this on. It seems like there's a few more comments just about parking lots and plants that work great in parking lots.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Juliana here today?
I don't have a question, but I could tell an amusing story.
If it's somehow related to watershed, riparian buffers,
Yes.
and native plants, go
It
ahead,
is.
Russ.
Okay, so so many years ago, I gave my first PowerPoint presentation to the Massachusetts Lawn and Landscape Association. This is the mow, blow, and go people. So I show up there, and there's like 300 people in the audience. So I put up my first slide, and it shows a whole bunch of guys fishing. And I said, how many of you guys like to fish? And everybody's hand goes up. Then the next slide I put up, it's a whole bunch of guys boating. And I said, how many of you guys like to go boating? And everybody's hand goes up. And then I said, okay, now I have to tell you how your day jobs might be ruining what you like to do on the weekends. And so then I go on with my slideshow about the importance of maintaining naturally vegetated riparian areas along waterways, and how it's not good to have lawns go all the way to the water, and gave slide after slide after slide of examples of where homeowners preserved their views and yet had natural vegetation, you know, with a nice winding trail going down to the water, and they could still look over the low growing vegetation and see the lake and all that stuff. And so when it came to the Q&A period, one guy's hand shot up and he said, that's a lot more work. And I said, yes, I'll admit it's more work than, you know, going out with a lawnmower, but I'm going to tell you right now, and this is many years ago when I first gave this talk, I said, more and more of your clients are going to be asking for this. And so my advice is learn how to do this, because you will find more and more of your clients looking for this kind of assistance. And I hope I'm right in that assessment.
That's, you know, what a brilliant way to start your presentation and rope them all in. And see, you know, you've been doing this for years, right? And I don't know how we really get the word out about the importance of these areas, and really try to bring people along, you know, bring homeowners along, you know, that you can have, it's the whole history of the lawn, right? You know, and everyone's desire for these long scenic landscapes. I think we just have to keep trying to get the word out.
Another question we have asking if anyone has information on eco pavers for driveways and parking lots, the one that has space for plants to grow, kind of like lattice work, and are these effective? Juliana, I'll let you comment, and I might have something else to add to that as well.
Oh, okay, good. So I just know about permeable pavers, which are used. They're much more eco-friendly than, say, you know, your traditional asphalt driveway. But I don't know about ones that are used with plants growing in between. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Maggie.
Well, I'm maybe not going to comment on those either, but I do think this idea of absorbing stormwater in the parking lots is really important. And there's many great examples of parking lots that are designed for filtering and funneling water to planted areas, bioswales, rain gardens, tree pits, all of these types of planting areas that can absorb some of the stormwater. To me, it seems that larger scale infiltration and absorption might be a little bit more effective than the lattice work type pavers. You know, I question, you know, what the lifespan of those might be, especially if we have trucks or heavy vehicles going through, and snow removal in the wintertime is also more of a challenge when you have plants kind of in the parking lot, or even having, you know, gravel parking lots are a bit more of a challenge. So, you know, if it's for a homeowner, a home situation, that might be different as compared to a public parking lot. Just a couple thoughts.
And areas, there are many areas that are trying to use the permeable pavers. The issue is they do require maintenance and have to be vacuumed out essentially. But towns are sharing the equipment, which is one way to get around the cost.
Yeah, just they have to be vacuumed out from sand and salt
Right.
and fine particulate matter that fills up the permeable holes that go through the pavers.
Maggie, I'll just add to that that the even with a permeable paver, the best of them is only able to absorb about 30% of the water that hits them, and there's still in a heavy rain going to be runoff. And so while that's a great product and there are many different approaches to it, including these open pavers that the gentleman mentions in his chat, but there's to combine it with the solutions you described is really how you get closer to 100% capture with the drainage of bioswales, the center islands, lots of tree cover. The canopies themselves are water captors. You know, between 40 to 70% of the rain that's captured on the canopy of a tree is reflected back out into the atmosphere, depending on the time of year and the cloud cover and a couple of other factors. So it's really there are multiple factors that control how much rain is contained and managed right within a parking lot. And it's just good to consider that because these paver things are not a perfect solution. They're expensive and you do have to maintain them. Sometimes they don't work as well as you think. I haven't personally used the open pavers, but I have known of people who tried to plant grass in them, and it was not an easy thing to do to keep it looking nice. And they ultimately just went to an open gravel in among the open pavers and quit trying to grow grass in it. So it's a multifaceted solution. That's the right way to say it.
All right, well, if there aren't any other questions right now, hopefully folks can, give a virtual round of applause for Juliana and the many things that she brought up today about how we can start changing our own gardens. It was really informative. And even though I've heard a similar presentation from her in the past, I still have so much more to think about and absorb. So I really appreciate that. I also want to invite all of you to join us next Wednesday, November 10th, for the second of our 3 presentations for the SALT conference. Next week, Jane Seymour, a DEEP wildlife biologist, will be talking with us about managing critical habitats and specifically at the Nearing Natural Area Preserve in Waterford, adjacent to Harkness State Park. And while we can do a lot to restore riparian buffers and coastal areas and our own landscapes, conserving a natural habitat is really important when we have that available to us. Jane has also promised to provide some inspiration for our own gardens, much as Juliana did here today. I want to thank you all for attending. If you have any questions about the presentation, feel free to send me an email and we can hopefully continue this conversation next week and into the future. Thank you all so much for being here today. We really appreciate it, and go home and enjoy your gardens.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.